Larivière, and I'm an artist. And in my presentation, I'm going to speak about my work, my publication project, The Specter of a Rose and its ramification. I will not present photographs because it would not mean anything to you to do so, but my presentation is most likely going to be from others today because different from others because I'm not going to analyze another artist's work, but focus on the project I'm currently working on and I've been developing for the last 2 years. So I would like to make it clear, very well in advance, that my presentation is a thought experiment on the place of fiction, effective thinking, and reenactment in the writing of art history. The Specter of a Rose is a publication project comprised of a novel with photographic inserts that together draw a portrait of contemporary Canadian women artists. My project is a creative response to the challenges of scholarship production on the recent history of art in Canada, specifically to A. Bronson's landmark 1987 exhibition and publication From the Sea to the Shining Sea at the Power Plant in Toronto, which underlines the collaborative constitutions of Artists Initiative in Canada. I think of the Specters of a Rose as an extension to that seminal publication, while its scope focuses on the importance of influence in Canadian feminist art since the 1990s. In this regard, significant events in the Canadian contemporary art scene coalesce with the many specificities of feminine artistic contributions to generate new potentialities for historical writing and scholarship. The Specter of a Rose also resonates with A. Bronson and Peter Opp's new artist book, Invocation of the Queer Spirits, and how it invokes the marginalized histories in a performance characterized as secret society. The Specter of a Rose documents this particular community of women first through photographic portraits of contemporary Canadian artists I'm acquainted with through my involvement in the art scene as an artist and cultural worker for over a decade. These portraits are reenactments of images selected from a broad and varied array of sources collected through my study of photographic archives. The sources are historical photography of women and, for the most part, taken or directed by women. My choice of sources to reenact is systematic as I'm looking into images I consider depicting proto-feminist performances. Conversely, the new photographic compositions tends to be constructed intuitively with the model and is telling of a reality of her own. Consequently, The Specter of a Rose is a performative collapse of many histories, canonical, unknown, and personal, where photographic portraits channels these pasts, not always acknowledge as such, contribution to feminism into the present. One of the interesting questions for me, and there's a lot of possibilities with it, is how critical it is to reenact history and what it does mean to change history even a little bit. On top of that, what does it mean now as opposed to 10 years ago? The most obvious is the potential for revision that reenactment of history ultimately offers. But beyond pointing to the continued absence of women in Canadian art history, reenactment does underline the ever-existing resistance women have always expressed towards their effacement in history. In choosing proto-feminist photographic sources, what also happens by having two histories to coalesce is the possibility to make the photographic events say what it always intended to from an art historical perspective. A new iteration of an event created through reenactment performs its original intended meaning to remind us of the ongoing and still current struggle of being a woman artist in Canada. Ultimately, it appears to me to be a very productive and positive way to move beyond the repetition of canonical history of art. Reenactment also bridges conversation between historical figures of feminism and contemporary Canadian artists. In fact, contemporary artists never work alone, and as such, they are in constant dialogue with the history of art and involved in conversation with their contemporaries. This exact notion of influence is central to The Specter of a Rose, just as I think it is imperative to the construction and emergence of what critic and curator Lucy Lippard characterized as the most important art movement of the past few decades, feminist art. My project, The Specter of a Rose, is a conversation invoking the past of feminism, but also constructing a contemporary history with a novel being written based on interviews that I conduct with the same Canadian women artists I photograph. I amalgamate the different voices creatively to compose fictional characters, yet I retain what is specific about these feminine artistic experiences and contribution. The same collaborative approach to writing has been used for the present elocution, which is based on a conversation I had with two colleagues. Together, our three voices speak of the hope and vision we share for the project, The Specter of a Rose. The process of actively constructing the narrative with the participants does embody this exact notion of a secret community of women in the arts in Canada, while the meshing of multiple voices into the text is meant to preserve the colloquial tonalities of a continuing oral tradition of the history of art by women. The particular ways in which these women artists project themselves as artists and as feminists in the public space defines what constitutes this secret community. The Specter of a Rose documents the reality of artists who are thinking their practice and career differently than what is socially recognized as successful. Not only does it work outside this logic, but its secrecy is in fact an assumed posture that performs a rejection of a certain capitalist ideology's value in contemporary art. It is also a deflective strategy against the increasing rejection by society of feminist values. Such resistance and persistence, one could argue, signpost that these contemporary women artists have singularly inscribed their subjectivity into the specific conditions of the art milieu in Canada. Such inscription, of course, has consequences not just for the individuals in question, but for those working at documenting their histories. So what are the consequences? How can we talk of women artists organized as a secret community and respect the integrity of their practice in a written account of their history? The answer is fiction. When I first reflected on what it meant to imagine history and its future, my reflex was to feel artists were somewhat outside of the equation. How can art history be imagined before the production of the artworks by artists? And how to think of the future of art history outside of fiction writing in the arts? Is it a proposition to create fictional works and writing the future of art history? I'm obviously aware that what is truly at stake with this working proposition of the future of history, and it resides outside of this first-degree personal consideration of mine. Yet my feeling is that my reaction to it underlines the fundamental need to expose the kind of fiction that are created when scholars tries to write history. Indeed, what is the place of fiction in history? And this is exactly what the Specter of a Rose is essentially getting at. Fiction in art history occurs much more commonly than we often think. For example, the exceptional case of Jeanne Duval. She was the inspiration of one of the greatest poets of the 19th century. She was Charles Baudelaire's mistress. Little is known of Jeanne Duval, so little in fact her patronage is uncertain. There is not even an explanation as to why up until today the name Jeanne Duval remains prevalent in contemporary scholarship. Paradoxically, Jeanne Duval made a name for herself by being at the center of two of the greatest artistic scandals of modernity that revolutionized painting and poetry, l'Olympia Barmanet and Fleur du Mal de Baudelaire. The sparsity and quality of primary sources available on Jeanne Duval, the defaming caricature made of her by the critique of Baudelaire's work, the real allegorical portraits by early modernists Edouard Manet and Gustave Courbet, and the destruction of her personal correspondence with the poet, blurs the line completely of a figure into fiction. How, as an art historian, can we talk of someone there's nothing to be said? And how, if not with the help of fiction, do we paint a portrait of such a mysterious woman? With the Specter of a Rose, I'm setting out to do what is inadvertently done to the historical figure like Jeanne Duval, in that I'm consciously stepping out of the boundaries instead for productive writing of history. Ultimately, I like to imagine Jeanne Duval's enduring, persisting presence in history similarly to the Zen Buddhist statement John Gage made to a group of abstract expressionist painters some while ago. I have nothing to say, and I'm saying it, and that is poetry as I need it. As a result of the increased demand for literacy, both literary and theoretical, that has become an essential ingredient of art education, Fiction has also become one of the most sophisticated strategies to reconcile the obligatory use of the I with the self-historicizing task at hand required in today's context of academic knowledge production on art. The recent emergence of the artist scholars in academic milieu created a wave of new creative models for the writing and rewriting of art histories, which for the most part includes literary device of fictional writing, which ultimately culminates in a resurgence of poetics in art discourses. Consequently, the Specter of a Rose is a critical examination of the role of art historian and how it values effective thinking and fiction of artistic practices in the creation of history. In fact, I think it's pretty much the art of my project. The project wants to underline the importance of thinking art with sensitivity, with the body as a whole, and even beyond oral communication, because there are things that needs to be told about this secret community of Canadian artists that can only be attained through fiction, as it allows for the realization of certain complex emotive states or knowledge-sensitive muted situation. And obviously, it also considers how this specific way of thinking art can impact forms of writing about art, while the answer brings us again to poetics. The fictional register of the Specter of a Rose is produced in an attempt to describe a particular subjective reality of these artists' community. It records the history of their artistic accomplishments and contributions, but also renders the emotive and psychological lives of these artists. The project is interested in the specificity of relationship these women's artists establish between themselves and the world that informs their practice. It also reflects the fictions of artists' practices as a token vision of the world, and these fantasizes artistic position must be accounted for with integrity in respect of the fiction of these artists' practices. As an artist myself, I aim to historicize the work of my colleague. My community is thus to embark on the fiction they propose. It is to enact the work in a poetic performance of writing. The performativity that fiction allows in telling the stories of the secret community of women artists is a required contemporary spin for the feminism of the Specter of a Rose to come out. While I'm aware that the notion of the construction of history is widely recognized, I believe it is important to be reminded of the boundaries that we set ourselves in creating histories. I chose with the Specter of a Rose to go one step further, transgress the boundary and use fiction writing to my advantage in the production of knowledge on Canadian women artists and their practice. Ultimately, the posture I take as an artist to write the Specter of a Rose is specifically concerned with pointing to the constructiveness of history and to the strange boundary between truth and fiction. The project actively encouraged maintaining a blind spot in my understanding of history, that blind spot being exactly located with a fine line between fact and fiction cross paths. This is especially pertinent in the context of the Specter of a Rose because it is produced within my doctoral project, which implies that my thesis is meant to be rigorous and true in a lot of ways, but instead I consciously choose to perform history, make art is the process of writing history. Thank you.